If you've ever opened Esports Manager 2026 and found yourself lost trying to understand why your team isn't making any progress, relax, because that happened to me too. I spent hours testing strategies, failing due to wrong decisions, and learning the hard way what actually works in this game. Today, I am going to give you 10 advanced tips that helped me a lot and can help you too. I'm Matthew, and the video is about to start. If there is one thing I used to underestimate in Esports Manager 2026, it is how much the tactic creator genuinely changes the game when used correctly per map. It is not just a nice detail or something extra, it is literally where you start separating an okay team from a dominant one. When you abandon generic setups and start thinking map by map, it feels like the game opens up a whole new level of depth. The key point here is respecting each player's confidence rating on each specific map. There is no use forcing an aggressive entry frag on Mirage if that player clearly feels more comfortable playing passively on that map. When you adjust roles based on this, everything starts clicking into place. Executions become cleaner, mid-round decisions make more sense, and even mistakes decrease. It seems small, but in the semi-3D simulation, this heavily impacts match results. Another thing that makes a massive difference is fine positioning and mid-round preferences. It is not just about defining who does what, but how and when. For example, adjusting a more active lurker on Dust 2 or keeping a support further back on Mirage can completely change the flow of the match. When you start observing how your team behaves during rounds and refining these details, you can feel that you are truly shaping the team's style. And seriously, testing before majors is not optional, it is mandatory. I've made the mistake of going into a big tournament with a tactic that only worked on paper, and the result was a disaster. The ideal approach is to simulate, adjust, test again, and only then trust it. When you enter a major with tactics already refined per map, the difference is night and day. It feels like your team plays with much more consistency and confidence. If there is one skill that truly separates an average manager from someone who wins an unlikely series, it is economic control. You cannot play on autopilot, choosing a standard buy every round. Every decision to eco, semi-buy, or force needs to have a clear reason, because the game heavily punishes anyone who mismanages their money. The most interesting part is how the force buy stops being a desperate move and becomes a strategic tool. There are moments when breaking the opponent's economy is worth much more than securing a safe round further down the line. When you hit this timing right, it feels like a switch flips. The other team falls into a domino effect, starts playing under pressure, and you take control of the series. Another layer that many people ignore is timeouts and halftime talks. They are not just there for show. Using a timeout before a decisive round to reorganize the buy and align the strategy can save a game. Furthermore, the morale boost during halftime, when well utilized, helps immensely to maintain team consistency, especially when facing a stronger opponent. And let me tell you, when you master this economic management, you start winning series that, on paper, were guaranteed losses. I've seen my own team turn games around just because I fitted in two well-calculated force buys and destroyed the other side's finances. It is the kind of detail that does not stand out as much as a flashy play, but it is exactly what decides championships. At the beginning, the temptation is to cram heavy training sessions into every single day, thinking this will accelerate the team's evolution. However, the game penalizes this in a very clear way. You might improve in certain aspects, but general performance starts to drop once fatigue and exhaustion set in. Setting up a smart weekly plan makes all the difference. It is not just training for the sake of training, it is knowing how to divide focus between aim, game sense, and mental resilience. When you strike that balance, the team evolves much more consistently. You can see that the players become more confident in their decisions and make fewer mistakes during critical moments. The real game-changing point is avoiding overtraining. Burnout here is not a minor detail. It drops morale and directly affects how the team performs in important matches. I've had lineups that looked perfect on paper but started falling apart simply because I pushed training too hard and ignored the signs of fatigue. This is where the strategic side of the staff comes in, using psychologists, investing in team building, and organizing the calendar properly. These details keep the team at their peak during long tournaments, which is where it truly matters. When you reach a decisive phase with a mentally intact team, the difference is massive. They play looser, with more confidence, and far more consistently. If there is one place where many campaigns fall apart, it is the transfer market. At first, it seems simple. You see a superstar available, you go ahead and sign them. However, once you start paying attention to salary, contract duration, and bonuses, you realize that each of these decisions can compromise the entire financial health of the team for several seasons. Timing here is everything. Sometimes it is worth much more to wait for the right moment in the market rather than buying on impulse. A player in a slump, a contract nearing its end, or even changes in the meta can open up much better opportunities. When you learn to read these dynamics, you start closing much smarter and more sustainable deals. Another point I consider crucial is clauses. It is not just about the salary amount, but performance bonuses, buyouts, and specific conditions that can turn into a ticking time bomb in the future. I've seen contracts that looked great on paper turn into a nightmare once the player started hitting goals and inflating costs without delivering proportionally inside the server. Honestly, one of the best strategies I found was investing in loans and promising young players. You keep the team competitive without locking up the budget, and you still gain margin to adjust the lineup as the scene changes. In the long run, this flexibility makes a major difference, especially when you want to build a strong team without being held hostage by heavy contracts. Early in the campaign, it is very easy to fall into the trap of spending everything exclusively on players and forgetting about the staff, but this costs you dearly later on. When I started investing early in a complete team outside the server, the impact was immediate. It feels like everything around the team runs smoother, and not just inside the matches. Analysts, for instance, make an incredible difference. They help you understand the meta, suggest tactical adjustments, and even point out weaknesses that you might not notice while playing several consecutive matches. It is that kind of silent advantage that accumulates, and before you know it, your team is always one step ahead. The mental side is on another level entirely. Psychologists keep morale stable, prevent sudden drops in performance, and help the team handle pressure during decisive moments. In long tournaments, this becomes a massive differentiator. While other teams start to fluctuate, yours remains consistent because it is well structured behind the scenes. And you cannot ignore the impact of media specialists either. They help grow the brand, improve sponsorships, and ultimately bring more money into the budget. When you put it all together, it becomes clear. A good staff is not an expense. It is an investment. It multiplies the roster's performance in a way that simply buying players can never achieve alone. This is one of the most invisible layers, yet it is one that decides results the most. You can have an incredible roster on paper, but if the chemistry doesn't click, the team simply won't perform. The simulation takes morale and chemistry very seriously, so ignoring this is practically playing against yourself. The talk module is where many people drop the ball, but for me, it became a mandatory tool. That is where you understand what is going on with each player, resolve conflicts before they become real problems, and adjust expectations. Sometimes it is something simple, like a player dissatisfied with their role, which is already affecting performance inside the server without you realizing it. Now, the most critical point for me is the IGL. There is no use choosing just the guy with the best stats. He needs to have tactical preferences that match the team's style. When this aligns, mid-round calls flow naturally, the team reacts better to situations, and you see far fewer rounds lost to indecision. When you combine good chemistry, aligned personalities, and an IGL who actually works within the system, the team gains incredible consistency. It is the kind of thing that does not stand out as much as a star player carrying the game, but in the long run, it is what transforms a good roster into a team that actually competes for titles. There is a classic mistake I used to make constantly, treating the simulation mode as if it were automatic, like hit play and hope for the best. But it does not work that way. If you do not interfere, the AI makes questionable decisions at key moments, and by the time you notice, you have already lost control of the match. For me, the game changes completely when you start viewing each round as something alive. Lost 2 rounds in a row? That is already a sign to stop, use a timeout, and change what needs to be changed. Sometimes it is not even a massive adjustment. Just reorganizing the setup or tweaking the approach breaks the opponent's momentum and prevents that snowball effect. Another factor that carries a lot of weight is observing player behavior during the match. When someone tilts or starts making too many mistakes, the game practically screams it at you. Ignoring these signs is letting the problem grow. Small mid-match adjustments, changing a role, repositioning, easing responsibilities can completely save that player's performance. In the end, the difference lies in reacting. Each simulation is dynamic and full of variations, so sticking to the initial plan the entire time is asking for failure. When you start intervening with confidence, reading the game's momentum, and making quick decisions, it feels like you are truly commanding the team, rather than just watching them lose. One of the biggest traps is building a roster looking solely at ratings. It is very tempting to grab the players with the highest numbers and assume that will solve everything. But in practice, it does not work that way. I've seen lineups full of stars simply fail to click, while more modest teams play much better together. When you start focusing on synergy, scouting changes completely. Map pool confidence, preferred roles, and even playstyle begin to weigh much more than just raw aim or general statistics. A player might be great on paper, but if they do not fit into the tactics or the team's rhythm, they become a weak point instead of a solution. Another factor I consider essential is mental resilience. In high-pressure moments, this makes a massive difference. Some players maintain consistency even in tough series, while others disappear completely. When you factor this into recruitment, your team becomes far more reliable throughout tournaments. Ultimately, what actually wins games is the collective unit. A team with good chemistry, well-defined roles, and aligned tactics can beat theoretically superior rosters. When everything clicks, it feels like each player elevates the other, and that is when you realize that building a team goes way beyond simply adding up ratings. A major turning point for me was understanding that it is not enough to just build a good team. You need to grow the organization alongside it. If the focus remains solely inside the server, sooner or later you hit a limit, whether financial or reputational, and then it becomes much harder to take the next step. Sponsorships come in exactly at this point. It is not about just accepting any proposal, but choosing partnerships that make sense for your roster's current moment and your goals. A well-negotiated contract guarantees stability and gives you room to invest with more security without always playing at risk. Speaking of investment, that is where many campaigns break. Spending heavily on talent might solve things in the short term, but if you do not control the finances, you end up stalling the organization's future. I've been through this. I built a strong team, but was left with absolutely no flexibility to adjust when the meta changed. On the other hand, when you work well on branding, everything starts to flow better. Better players become interested in your team, more qualified staff appears, and you begin to have more options in every area. In the long run, this matters immensely. Because it is not just about winning right now, it is about building an organization that remains competitive season after season. Planning the calendar is not just about looking at dates and seeing when there is a tournament. It is about understanding your team's rhythm throughout the season. If you keep putting your starting lineup into every single tournament, you might get results in the short term, but further down the line, the bill arrives in the form of fatigue, performance drops, and even virtual injuries that ruin your planning. Rotating the roster becomes almost mandatory when the schedule gets brutal. This is where a decision comes in that many people ignore: trusting the academy, junior players, or even using loans intelligently. It is not just about getting them a rest. It is about maintaining a competitive level while protecting your stars. I like to think of it like a football squad. You do not play the entire season with just the starters. You need pieces that can hold down the game when necessary. Now, the most important point: preserving your best players for the right moments. A major is no place for a tired or mentally drained player. If you arrive there with the whole team rested and prepared, the difference is night and day. While other teams are broken after a heavy sequence of matches, yours enters sharp, and that usually decides close series. In the long run, this mindset changes everything. Instead of spending tons of money buying ready-made players all the time, you start developing talent in-house. This not only saves resources, but also creates a sustainable cycle for your team to grow season after season. Honestly, there's something much more satisfying about seeing a rookie you trained become a star than simply signing someone already at their peak.
I feel like I'm losing my